15 years ago, I was studying for the ministry at Emerson Theological Institute in Central California. One of the required courses was the origin and history of New Thought. And the final exam consisted of 30 questions and topics for which essay answers were required. A few months ago, when we were picking topics and speakers for Unity in the Olympics, I noticed that the origin and history of New Thought was a possible topic, so I volunteered for that, thinking that I could exhume my Emerson exam paper and complete my preparation for the talk with minimal effort. Fool that I was, and am. The text for the Emerson course was a 571-page book written by Charles Braden in 1963. Braden was the professor and chair of the Department of History and Literature of Religions at Northwestern University. This book was authoritative and exhaustive. But he died in 1970, so it really wasn't up to date, which led me to supplement my reading with two other books. These were by an author, biographer, and historian, Neil Valley, a 1993 book on Ernest Holmes, and a 2002 book on the Unity movement. Since completing my Emerson studies, I came across three more books. A 1999 book by Eugene Taylor, professor at Harvard Medical School, mostly on Swedenborg, and a 628-page book by Catherine Albanese, a truly comprehensive book. She is the professor and chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and also former president of the American Academy of Religion. And in addition, I supplemented this with a more recent book of 510 pages, one of over a dozen by Gary Lachman, a writer on consciousness and culture, to provide context, which is to say, the big picture. So here I am with way too much material to start with. That is the 2005 Emerson exam paper, which was already too much, and now updated and augmented by three more profound and hefty tomes, bringing the total page count to 2,681. Talk about 10 pounds in a 5-pound bag, or maybe 10 tons. What I'm going to do is this. I'm going to give you a quick synopsis, all that I can cram into 20 minutes without talking too fast, I hope, and follow up by offering you my updated paper, which is 26 pages. And you can read that to yourself, to give yourself something to occupy your mind during the present or future times of social distancing. So here it goes. In 1951, the German-Swiss psychiatrist and philosopher Karl Jaspers proposed the idea of an axial age, axial, A-X-I-A-L, an axial age in which new ways of thinking emerged that fundamentally changed human development. It began as early as 800 BC and extended until about 200 BC. And in the middle of that, around 500 BC, the spiritual foundations of humanity were laid simultaneously and independently in China, India, Persia, Palestine, and Greece. In China, there was Confucius and Lao Tzu. In India, it was the age of the Upanishads and of the Buddha. Zoroaster emerged in Persia and laid the foundations of Zoroastrianism. The Hebrew prophets, Elijah, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, arose in Palestine. And in Greece, we had Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle to give us the beginning of philosophy with the arrival of a new kind of individual the thinker, whose appearance can be regarded as the result of bicameral man's nervous breakdown. In 1976, there was a book written by Julian Jaynes, a professor of psychology at Princeton, entitled The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. He's explaining that prior to this time, human consciousness was split into two essentially independent parts. The older part, identified with the right hemisphere of the brain, sees the big picture all at once, somewhat intuitively, somewhat out of focus. The left part, the newer part, identified with the left hemisphere, operates rationally, filtering out extraneous information to focus on details. It's the right brain that gives us poetry, art, and music, and the left gives us alphabets, words, letters, grammar, as well as literature, law, and science. These two approaches to human consciousness have coexisted in humans now for the past 2,500 years, cooperating to some extent, but not always peacefully. Their interaction occurs not only individually within each person, but also collectively, so that some people, groups, and eras are dominated by artistic and intuitive thinking, while others are detail-oriented and specific, like computers. Put another way, the left brain observes what's going on, like an objective and independent scientist, while the right brain participates emotionally with what is in the mind, as in a religious experience. And at various times in history, one of these ways of experiencing life seems to dominate. Karen Armstrong has written about this in her 2006 book, The Great Transformation, which provides a broad context of where we can better understand what we call New Thought, or any other religious creed for that matter. So what is New Thought? New Thought is a religious movement which developed in the United States in the latter part of the 19th century. It holds that, first, God, or infinite intelligence, is supreme, universal, and everlasting. It's immanent, that means right here, indwelling. All wisdom, all goodness, ever present in the universe as a warm and tender Father, not as a cold abstraction. Secondly, divinity, God, if you will, dwells within each person, and all people are spiritual beings. Third, the highest spiritual principle is to love one another unconditionally, which is reflected in teaching and healing one another. And finally, mind is primary and causative, while matter is secondary. Thus, our mental states are carried forward into manifestation and become our experience in daily living. Sickness originates in the mind, and right thinking has a healing effect. New Thought grew out of a romantic movement that originated in Europe near the end of the 18th century, partly as a reaction to modernity, in particular the Industrial Revolution, the strict social and political norms of the Enlightenment, and the scientific rationalization of nature. It grew from the German Sturm und Drang movement that preferred intuition and emotion to the rationalism of the Enlightenment. In opposition to Calvinism, New Thought embraced the New England transcendentalism of Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, which portrayed a more personal, less restrictive relationship between God and man. Along with Christian Science, Transcendentalism, Theosophy, and other movements born from similar interests, early New Thought leaders shared a romantic interest between metaphysics and American Christianity, especially the Transcendentalist belief that ideal spirituality transcends the physical and is realized only through individual intuition instead of through religion and religious institutions. So now that you've got that straight, who's responsible for this? Well, before anyone practiced New Thought as a set of beliefs, there were a few influential figures teaching ideas that contributed to the movement. Ralph Waldo Emerson certainly was one, and his philosophical movement of transcendentalism is incorporated throughout New Thought. Emanuel Swedenborg, the founder of the 18th century New Church, also extended clear influence on many authors' New Thought writings on the Bible. But it is Phineas Parkhurst Quimby, born 1802, died 1866, who is widely recognized as the founder of the New Thought movement. Quimby learned about the power of the mind to heal through hypnosis when he attended a lecture on Franz Mesmer's work. So Quimby began to practice hypnotism, or mesmerism, as it was called, in 1840, and formed the view that illness is a matter of the mind. He developed his own clairvoyant abilities and used them in diagnosis and distance healing. He also understood, at least intuitively, the interdependence of mind and body, especially the power of the mind to affect the body, both in creating disease and in healing the same. In that connection, he said that disease is a belief, that the trouble is in the mind, which has been deceived by somebody or something. He put priests and doctors at the head of his list of deceivers, saying that these two classes are the foundation of more misery than all other evils, for they have a strong hold on the minds of the people by their deception and cant. Quimby opened an office for mental healing in Portland, Maine in 1859, and one of his first clients was Julius Dresser, a Calvinist Baptist ministerial candidate. Dresser and his future wife Annetta were healed in a short time, and in 1882 they began promoting what they called the Quimby system of middle treatment of diseases in Boston. Meanwhile, in 1862, Mary Baker Eddy, originally a Congregational church member, came to Quimby, hoping to be healed from lifelong ill health. She went on to organize a healing ministry which produced both Christian Science and the whole metaphysical movement, which includes both Christian Science and New Thought. Because of this, while not seen as the New Thought denomination, Christian Science is largely regarded by New Thought followers to be heavily driven by New Thought beliefs. Christian Scientists, no surprise, disagree, frequently stating that Eddy was not influenced by Quimby. Nevertheless, in 1875, Mrs. Eddy published her magnum opus, a book called Science and Health. It's about the same size as those big ones I just waved at you. And she forbade others in the movement to alter or even question anything in it. She also dictated the form of organization under which the church operates in her church manual, and which her followers regard as divinely inspired. Consequently, Christian Scientists are convinced, or claim to be, that Mrs. Eddy's teaching constitute a final revelation, exempt from any additions, subtractions, or modification, whereas New Thought believes that such a final revelation cannot and will not ever occur. Last but not least, Christian Science is completely opposed to conventional medicine based upon drug, surgery, or physical manipulation, whereas New Thought takes no such absolute position regarding cooperation with doctors in the treatment of disease, notwithstanding Quimby. Meanwhile, Quimby had an organization. He didn't care about building one. He didn't write about what he was doing until his followers urged him to do that. And even then, he only circulated what he had written in manuscript form, which was not published until much later by Horatio Dresser, son of the couple who had come to Quimby back in 1862. But in 1863, a former Methodist minister and Swedenborgian minister named Warren Felt Evans came to Quimby for healing, and when he was healed shortly after, he started writing New Thought literature. One source names him as the first person to publish a clear philosophy based on Quimby's practices, which has led others to name Evans as the founder of New Thought. Evans believed in the essential divinity of man. All men of every clime and color, he said, are the sons of God and are incarnations of the divinity. Man is really a soul that has an existence prior to its embodiment in visible form, although he doesn't say what this existence is. and it may lie beyond the limits of human understanding for the present if it is not to be classed among things unknowable. Just as the soul is continually formed of God, so the soul forms the body of itself as a perpetual creation of mind. The body is a mere something added to the mind, not a mere something, but a representation of the mind to itself. Thus, man's dualism as body and soul is reduced to an indivisible, inseparable unity, which is mind. Unlike Christian scientist, Evans did not condemn the use of traditional medical techniques, but he does find that the simultaneous treatment by mental and physical techniques methods is not a good idea. Psychological influence is potent in healing. It acts upon the spiritual body and through this on the material organism. Health is a normal thing. Disease is abnormal. There is a mysterious healing power always at work in the human body wherever there is an injury or malfunctioning of any kind, and this will often affect a cure without any other actions required. But the healing process can be greatly accelerated by the conscious and voluntary action of the mind, assisted if necessary by some other person. Two things are necessary for a person to be cured thus: a desire to get well and faith in the effectiveness of the healer. The way to cure another is to forget that the patient has a physical body and to speak as a spirit to his spirit. Evans believed, like Quimby and Eddy, that he was using the rediscovered method of Jesus in healing. In his earlier healing practice, he was concerned primarily with mental healing, but later he was more insisting in coupling religion with healing. The healer must have faith in God and confidence in his or her own ability. After the philosophy of New Thought was established, several individuals and organizations rose to prominence to promote those beliefs. One of Eddy's early Christian Science students was Ursula Gestefeld, who created a philosophy called the Science of Being after Eddy kicked her out of her church. Science of Being groups eventually formed the Church of New Thought in 1904, which was the first group to call itself New Thought. While Julius Dresser and his son Horatio sometimes credited as founders of New Thought as a named movement, others also share the title. Horatio wrote a history of the New Thought movement, a book which was published in 1919, and named his father as an essential figure in founding it all. Emma Curtis Hopkins is also considered a founder. A former student of Mary Baker Eddy, she's called the teacher of teachers because of the number of people she taught who went on to found groups within the New Thought movement. After learning from Hopkins, Annie Ricks Millets went on to found the Home of Truth, another New Thought group. And Melinda E. Kramer became a co-founder of Divine Science along with Nona Brooks. Charles and Bertil Fillmore, who went to Hopkins together, went on to found the Unity School of Christianity afterwards. Authors also learned from Hopkins, including Dr. H. Emily Cady, writer of Unity textbooks entitled Lessons in Truth, and New Thought poet Ella Wheeler Wilcox. So we can see that Emma Curtis Hopkins influenced a great number of New Thought leaders. Ralph Waldo Trine, T-R-I-N-E, was the most widely read of the early New Thought writers, primarily because of his book In Tune with the Infinite, published in 1897, which is, according to Braden's book, an almost perfect presentation of New Thought at its best. The book is now published in the latest edition called The Best of Ralph Waldo Trine, and there's a copy in the Unity the Olympics Library. Curiously enough, it studiously omits any mention of New Thought by those terms. But Braden says that no single writer has expressed its essential message more clearly or more engagingly than Trine has done. Braden cites Trine's views of Jesus as distinct from the Christ, not the same thing, as a major reason for his book's success. The great central fact of his teaching was that this conscious union of man with the Father, it was made the complete realization of this oneness with the Father on his part that made Jesus the Christ. Braden's perspective on this is interesting considering his own religious affiliation. The statement would hardly satisfy the fundamentalist or those who have a strong dogmatic Christology, but it made a profound appeal to those who had become impatient of dogma, which made Jesus chiefly an actor on the stage in what seemed to many as an artificial drama of salvation. The major New Thought organizations today are three: Unity, Divine Science, and Religious Science, and then there are some smaller ones as well. You all know of Unity. It's where we be. In 1886, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore were introduced to the teachings of Emma Curtis Hopkins by one of her students. Charles was not impressed, but Myrtle experienced a true revelation and subsequently healed herself over a 2-year period of her tuberculosis. This led to healing others, and soon the Fillmores were studying under another Hopkins disciple and eventually under Mrs. Hopkins herself. In 1889, Charles began publishing a new magazine, Modern Thought, and in the following year, Myrtle formed the Society of Silent Help, later known as Silent Unity. The society grew to 10,000 members by 1903 and 15,000 by 1906, when it moved into a new 3-story office building, its first. A larger building followed in 1914, and by 1929, the Unity School occupied an entire city block in downtown Kansas City. And after that, the Fillmores bought a plot of land in Lee Summit, southeast of town, and incorporated it as a separate town, now known as Unity Village. The Fillmores always regarded Unity as an educational entity, not a church. They began teaching classes in practical Christianity in the 1890s, and in 1909 they expanded their offerings to include correspondence courses. An intensive training school was operated from 1919 to 1922. Summer conferences were held annually from 1922 to 1930. A Ministers Association was formally created in 1946 to improve the management of the more than 200 centers that existed by then. And in 1966, an Association of Unity Churches was formed to allow the field ministries to operate independently with no guidance or control from the Unity School. Myrtle Fillmore died in 1931 at the age of 86, and Charles, who was 9 years younger than her, died in 1948 at age 94. Their son, Lowell, served as general manager of the school from 1916 until his father's death when he assumed the presidency. He held that post until he died in 1975. Another son, Waldo Rickert Fillmore, was a major creative force in the school, designing much of Unity Village and leading various educational initiatives. And his son, Charles Rickert Fillmore, became president in 1971, and his daughter, the great-granddaughter of Charles Fillmore, the original, Constance Fillmore Bazzi, succeeded him in that role as president in 1987. In 2001, Unity operated with an internal board of trustees made up of Unity employees and headed by one of the 4 generations of the Fillmore family. Then Connie Fillmore Bazzi announced the formation of an independent board and said she would remain on the board for 3 years until the transition to a more traditional non-profit management board structure was complete.